Now let's talk about the casting. To me, Jeffrey Dean Morgan is the comedian. From now on, whenever I read the graphic novel, I always picture his voice and his mannerisms in my head. His performance in the movie reminds me of Alex from A Clockwork Orange. The stuff he does is so despicable, but at the same time, he's so charming and charismatic you can't help but fall in love with him.
What happened to the American dream? What happened to the American dream? It came true. You're looking at it.
How art thou, thou globby bottle of cheap, stinking chip oil? Come and get one in the yarbles! If you have any yarbles, you eunuch jelly thou!
The comedian is an interesting character because everybody has a different take on him. His motivations are never exactly clear for why he's doing what he's doing, which leaves him open for interpretation. But I always saw the comedian as a parody of other superheroes. He's doing all these terrible things, but he's doing them in the name of justice and nationalism, which means he can get away with it. He knows what he's doing is wrong, but he knows nobody is going to try and stop him. In fact, it almost seems like he's trying to test how far he can go before somebody will do something about it. And ironically, the person who ends up killing him is Ozymandias, the one person he believes is truly despicable. To him, that's why this is all just a great big joke, and this is what Jeffrey Dean Morgan seems to nail about his character so perfectly.
He's a hero without morals. You know, he fought in all these wars, and I think he was doing things for the right reason, but the things he did in the process of the end result, trying to get to the end result, are ultimately insane, I think.
Along the same lines, Jackie Earle Haley is Rorschach. Again, whenever I read the graphic novel, I always picture his voice and his mannerisms in my head. He's violent, he's intimidating. He's the exact opposite of how Jackie Earle Haley is when you watch interviews with him. This is the sign of an amazing actor, and that's all that really needs to be said about him.
I'm not locked in here with you.
You're locked in here with me.
You know, it was really important that, Dad really liked what was going on here.
Billy Crudup doesn't get as much credit for playing Dr. Manhattan as he probably should. Having another actor play Dr. Manhattan could have been the most boring thing ever. He could have been played by a robot who would have made him super serious and super monotone, like they were trying to do a HAL 9000 impression.
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
However, Billy Crudup plays Doc in a way that's very reserved and soft-spoken. Even though he's essentially a god, it still feels like there's a human side of him. Even though he's all-powerful, he still feels grounded in reality. His performance actually reminds me of Spock from the original Star Trek series. He acts like he's emotionless and like he's detached from reality, but deep down they both find themselves full of emotion and conflict. There's a certain intensity to them brewing beneath the surface.
I am in control of my emotions. Control of my emotions.
I said, leave me alone!
I really like Patrick Wilson as Dan Dryberg. Just like Batman, Dan doesn't have any superpowers. The only reason he starts fighting crime is literally because he's bored and rich. In that regard, Patrick Wilson does a great job of making him feel like a normal person. Basically, he's just a guy who put on a superhero costume one day and started fighting crime. He has all the little subtleties down perfectly, like the way he speaks and how he seems to lack confidence in himself. In fact, Dan and Laurie serve a very important purpose in the story. In a world where Dr. Manhattan is building weird shit on Mars and Rorschach is brutally murdering people, Dan and Laurie are there to keep the story grounded and to remind us that we're still in the real world. Basically, they're our human connection to everything that's happening. Which brings us to Malin Ackerman, or however the hell you say her name. A lot of people don't like her as Laurie, but honestly, I don't have too much of a problem with her. She whines and complains all the time, which makes her come off as really catty and condescending, but in the graphic novel, that's all she does is whine and complain. everything. She complains about Rorschach, she complains about Dr. Manhattan, she complains about the comedian, she complains about her mother, she complains to Dan about everything there is to complain about ever. She complains about everything. If I have one gripe with the graphic novel, it's that Laurie is nowhere near as interesting as any of the other characters. Rorschach is a deontologist. From a moral standpoint, he determines what's right and what's wrong based on the action itself, not based on the consequences of those actions. Ozymandias believes in utilitarianism. For him, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The comedian is a nihilist and an absurdist who uses humor to make sense of a senseless world. Dr. Manhattan is also a nihilist as well as a determinist, believing everything that happens is determined by something that happened in the past. Dan is a humanist who believes in a strong code of ethics. He's a Boy Scout who plays by the rules, kind of. Laurie is kind of just there. She cares about people, I guess. She brings Dr. Manhattan back to Earth because she believes in him, I guess. Laurie really doesn't have much of a philosophy. In fact, the only reason she became a superhero in the first place is because her mother forced her to become a superhero. She's not rebuilding her faith in humanity like Dr. Manhattan is. She's not killing millions of people for the greater good like Ozymandias is. Laurie's only real moment of character development is when she finds out that the comedian is her father. Otherwise, she's kind of just wrestling between whether or not she wants to be with Manhattan or whether she wants to be with Dan. So I wouldn't blame Malin Ackerman for not giving a standout performance to a slightly boring and slightly underwritten character. The only time I don't like her performance is when she's first introduced. Her delivery is really inconsistent and just plain bad.
Rorschach, you shouldn't be here. You're a wanted man.
Nice to see you too, Silk Spectre.
I have a real name I've been using a couple years now. Try it.
I have a feeling like this was probably her first day of shooting because she's a lot better in the rest of the movie once she's eased into the character a little bit more. I actually like her conversations with Dan quite a bit. They have a good connection and play off each other well. So even though she may not be the best actress of all time, I can see why she was cast for the role. I'm sorry, but I don't like Matthew Good as Ozymandias. From the second he walks on screen, you can immediately tell he's the bad guy of the movie, for lack of a better term.
Conquest not of men, but of the evils that beset them. Fossil fuels, oil, nuclear power.
In exactly 5 days, we will be $100 billion richer.
According to the behind-the-scenes stuff, Matthew Good plays Ozymandias with an American accent in public, but a German accent in private. This is supposed to represent his duality as a character, and how he's ashamed of his parents' Nazi past. But at its core, Watchmen is a murder mystery. It's about trying to find out who killed the comedian. So when you have a character with two different accents, who clearly has something to hide, it really doesn't bode well for your murder mystery. In the graphic novel, Ozymandias is almost like a humanitarian figure. He revealed his secret identity to the world and managed to make billions of dollars selling toys of himself. He was tall, he was handsome, he was charming, he was athletic, he was a vegetarian, and he was the last person you'd ever expect to kill millions of people, which is exactly what made his whole plan so shocking. In the movie, Ozymandias lets a bunch of people get killed before he stops the assassin that he himself planted. He comes across like every other evil businessman in every other movie ever made.
No. You listen.
Fuck Gaspar Gomez and fuck the fucking Diaz brothers! Fuck them all! I buried those cockroaches!
Privately, I'm worth more than all of your corporations combined. I can buy and sell you 3 times over, which is something you should factor in.
In the graphic novel, Ozymandias is super lean and muscular. He looks like a superhero, and in fact, he looks like Superman. In the movie, Ozymandias is a scrawny guy with a weird haircut who looks nothing like a superhero at all. It might seem like I'm nitpicking, but this is actually a really crucial detail. Think about it. Do you really believe that this guy could beat up the comedian and throw him out a window? In the graphic novel, especially towards the end, Ozymandias looks really sad and like he's in pain. He's just killed millions of people in the name of peace. He's facing a serious moral dilemma of whether the ends will justify the means. Even at the very end of the book, when he asks Dr. Manhattan if he did the right thing, he has this really glum look on his face. He looks so sorry about what he's done, knowing it's only a temporary solution to a permanent problem. But in the movie, Ozymandias seems very cold and detached, like he doesn't have any problem with what he's doing. He lacks the emotion and the humanity that he does in the graphic novel, which is ironic considering he's being played by a real person. I can't say that I dislike Matthew Goode as an actor, but he definitely wasn't the right choice for the role. If you got another actor and if you tweak the direction a little bit, it would have turned out much better. Speaking of Superman, I always thought that Henry Cavill would have been a good choice for Ozymandias. For one thing, he's a really good actor, he looks like a superhero, he's charismatic as hell, and he's the last person you would ever expect to teleport a giant alien squid vagina monster into Manhattan. I don't like Carla Gugino's performance either. That old lady makeup does not work. At all. I mean, bad old person makeup doesn't really bother me that much. I am a fan of Star Trek after all. But whenever you're wearing old person makeup, you have to at least act like an old person. Usually this means changing your voice, or bending your fingers, or walking with a bent over posture. Did you know that Tilda Swinton played an old man in the Suspiria remake? But you would never know it's her because she's not acting like Tilda Swinton. She's acting like an old man with the way she walks and the way she talks. Meanwhile, Carla Gugino is still acting like a hot 20-something superhero. She's not acting like an old lady at all. Her and Laurie act more like sisters than they do like mother and daughter. Now let's talk about the pacing of the movie, aka the thing that will kill your Watchmen movie. Stanley Kubrick once said that editing is what defines film and separates it from any other medium. Things like acting and music and costume design exist in other mediums, like theater for instance, but editing is what truly makes a movie a movie. So while every movie is made in editing, Watchmen is a movie that's defined by its editing. Like I mentioned earlier, the biggest issue with adapting the graphic novel is how sporadic it is, and how we're constantly jumping from one character and one time period to the next. Trying to fit a book like this into a 2.5-hour movie is no easy task. You have to figure out how to pace the chapters, what to include, and what not to include. The whole book is over 90,000 words long, which is the length of a typical novel. But since this is a comic book, that means it's jam-freaking-packed full of information. If we're going to credit anybody for making the Watchmen movie turn out as well as it did, we have to thank the editor, William Hoy. Somehow he managed to condense 12 chapters of a graphic novel into a 2.5-hour movie. Relatively speaking, it's nowhere near as slow or as confusing as it probably should be. Relatively speaking, we have all the information we need, and almost everything is explained properly. Almost. That being said, there were always going to be pacing issues. There's simply no way around it, especially if you're going to be faithful to the source material. There's no way they were ever going to adapt it perfectly, word for word, page for page. It's one of those things where you're damned no matter what you do. I can see why so many studios shied away from this movie for so many years, knowing all the issues it would inevitably cause in the editing room, but I have to give credit where credit is due. The first hour of the movie is paced absolutely perfectly. It spends almost the entire time building up who the comedian is, but at the same time it manages to introduce all the other characters in a way that doesn't feel rushed. We get a sense of who everybody is and how they're related to each other. This part of the movie needed to be perfect. Everything that happens over the course of the movie is set into motion as soon as the comedian gets killed. In other words, if they didn't adapt this part of the book perfectly, the rest of the movie would have suffered as well. The only problem is, the first hour of the movie takes up only 2 chapters of the graphic novel. That means they had to condense 10 other chapters into only 90 minutes. There's so much going on it becomes sensory overload. It becomes difficult to follow along with what's happening simply because we're getting so much information at once. If you go to the bathroom and you miss 1 or 2 minutes of information, it's going to completely throw you off, which is going to make it difficult to follow along with what's happening for the rest of the movie. This movie doesn't have any chance to breathe. In the span of 90 minutes, we see Dr. Manhattan's backstory, Rorschach's backstory, Dan and Laurie having awkward sex to a Christian gospel song, Rorschach getting thrown in prison, Dr. Manhattan Laurie realizing the comedian is her father, getting busted out, investigating pyramid, and the list goes on. In a perfect world where we could have anything we wanted and there were no hidden fees on concert tickets and Pantera were still together and Slipknot still had all 9 members, Watchmen would have been a 12-episode miniseries on HBO or Netflix. Each episode would have been 45 minutes to an hour long, and it would adapt one chapter from the graphic novel. Again, it would not have been perfect. It was never going to be perfect. But it would have given the story time to breathe, and it would have helped us focus on the characters more. But of course, everything comes down to, what else? Freaking money. According to the highly reliable internet source Wikipedia, Zack Snyder wanted $150 million to make the Watchmen movie, but Warner Brothers would only give him $100 million. The movie ended up going over budget and costing $120 million. Again, this isn't too surprising if you consider how 200 sets were built for the movie, and how a lot of locations were made entirely with CGI. So if it takes $120 million to make a 2.5-hour long movie, think about how much it would have cost HBO to make a miniseries that was 12 hours long. And if you think about it, all the financing that went into this movie is freaking insane to begin with. Somehow, this dude right here convinced one of the largest movie studios in the world to give him $100 million for a wide-release movie that was a period piece, with no big-name actors, filled with blood and sex and blue penis. Not only is it a miracle that this movie ever got made, but never in a million years did it have any right to be as good as it is. Honestly, if you're looking for the best adaptation, you should watch the motion comic. You can find it on Amazon for like $10 probably. There's only one voice actor for the whole motion comic, which makes Laurie's voice sound absolutely hysterical.
Oh, God!
But the way they managed to adapt a static comic book into a motion picture is actually really impressive. It's the perfect way to watch a movie that's Watchmen related while still getting the full Watchmen experience.